Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Alice Winn at St. Paul Public Library, Highland Park. Alice Winn is the pen behind one of 2023's most talked about literary debuts. In Memoriam is a moving story of first love set against the cataclysmic backdrop of World War I. When young Henry Gaunt enlists in the British Army to dispel rumors of his family's pro-German leanings, boarding school classmate Sidney Ellwood is quick to follow him to the front line. Harrowing experiences in the trenches nurture a forbidden love. In a starred review, Booklist raves that Winn's finally accomplished debut novel is a rare thing. An intoxicating romance and an impossible-to-put-down war story in one. She captures the war as it looked, sounded, and smelled. But the ultimate death-defying acts here are in literature, breathtaking bravery and love. Among other high honors, In Memoriam received the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize in 2022 and the Waterstones Novel of the Year Award in 2023.
Well, that makes me feel very shy and embarrassed. Thanks for that. Hello, hi. I'm so happy to be here. This library is incredible, and what a lovely crowd. So thank you so much for all being so engaged and leaving your houses, which I'm sure are very comfortable. It's hard to get people to leave their houses. I wrote In Memoriam. We've already had a little bit of a description of what it's about. I wondered if I could just get a sense of whether anyone here has read it, because that can help me get a, oh my God, whoa, okay, wow, that's really great. Okay, that helps me kind of figure out how much I need to explain things. So the way I would describe this book for people who haven't read it is, it's about these two young men who are really good friends at this incredibly sheltered, idyllic boarding school in England in 1914. And both of these young men have a secret, and the secret is that each one is in love with the other. But they also both think that this love is unrequited. And because it's 1914, they're not able to talk about their love, right? They think it's a disaster if they try and mention it. And so then the war breaks out. And they both end up going to the Western Front and fighting in the Western Front. And the question of the novel changes. And instead of it being a question of, will they or won't they ever be able to confess their true feelings for each other, it becomes a question of, will they or won't they survive this war? So that's sort of how I describe the novel in the elevator. And I was thinking I could start by reading a little piece from it, but I actually would need a book for that. Does anyone? I got it. And so the passage that I like to read is from, thank you, this one, thank you. I love the paperback cover. I think it's just gorgeous. So the passage that I'm going to read about, so the two protagonists are Henry Gaunt, who is this sort of out of step with his own time, quite unpopular, sort of thuggish intellectual. And Sidney Ellwood, who is his close friend, who is incredibly charismatic and sort of dazzlingly charming and really popular and a true romantic. So Gaunt, Henry Gaunt, at the beginning of the novel, he is conducting a sort of toxic love affair with another boy from the school. And so the passage that I'm reading from is as a flashback to that toxic love affair. And it's happening when he's in, I think it would be junior year of high school. And the passage that I'm reading is, it's going to start with that, and then it's going to jump ahead to World War I, to the trenches, but don't worry, I'll guide you through it, you won't be confused. And the whole passage is about 5 minutes, so you can just relax while I read that. Okay. October 1913, lower 6th. What the hell do you think you're doing, Sandys? Hissed Gaunt. It was the middle of the night, and Sandys had roughly prodded him awake. Have you taken leave of your senses? I had to talk to you, said Sandys, climbing onto Gaunt's bed. Are you mad? Get out! What if someone comes in? They won't, said Sandys. Shut up a minute, I'm trying to think. It was the first year Gaunt had a room to himself, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there were 12 other boys in the room with him, waiting and listening. He sat up against the wall, as far away from Sandys as he could manage. If you've come here to... I haven't, said Sandys. That's what I'm here to talk to you about. Carruthers. He smiled dreamily. Stephen. What about Carruthers? I told him, said Sandys. Gaunt froze. Told him what, exactly? Sandys must have caught sight of his expression because he laughed. What about that, idiot? About how I felt, with regards to him. Gaunt stared at him. You talked to Carruthers about your feelings? Don't look so appalled, said Sandys. You're mad. Why on earth would you do such a thing? I'm glad I did it, said Sandys. Gaunt, he feels the same way. Although Gaunt was paranoid about making some noise and drawing the attention of some patrolling teacher, he got out of bed. He had to put more space between himself and Sandys. He feels the same way, he repeated. Yes, said Sandys, laying his head down on Gaunt's pillow. Get off my bed, said Gaunt. Sandys sat up, frowning. You understand, of course, he said, that this means you and I can't carry on. Christ, Sandys, I couldn't care less if we see each other again. Get off my bed. Sandys stood. He was broad and stocky, even in his childish pyjamas. Gaunt had never seen him naked, although he had seen every inch of his body. You should talk to Ellwood, said Sandys. You're mad. You're absolutely insane. I cannot believe you are saying any of this aloud, said Gaunt. We haven't got much time, said Sandys, and Gaunt didn't know if he meant that he would have to sneak out again in a minute, or if he meant it in a wider sense, that there wasn't much time before Oxford and Cambridge, before marriage and respectability, and the putting aside of boyish, immature desires. Sandys, said Gaunt, and his voice sounded much less firm than he would have liked. You can't talk like this. I can with you, said Sandys, and you can with me. Gaunt shook his head. It's one thing to do what we do to pass the time, he said. You behave as if you have so much time to spend, said Sandys, but you haven't. You're squandering your years as if they're limitless. It's the middle of the night. Get out of my room, said Gaunt. Stephen loves me, said Sandys. Gaunt slammed his fist into his desk, and Sandys yelped. What the hell are you talking about, said Gaunt. Stephen loves you. What absolute rot. Keep your voice down, said Sandys, and stop punching things, for God's sake. Hasn't it ever occurred to you that Ellwood might love you back? Gaunt shoved at Sandys, but Sandys had clearly been expecting something of the sort, and braced himself. When Gaunt went to hit him, Sandys blocked him. Calm down, said Sandys. You don't know what you're talking about, said Gaunt. What's the worst that could happen, really, if you told him? It was as if Sandys was some visitation from another planet. What's the worst that could happen? Repeated Gaunt in disbelief. I could be expelled. I could be sentenced to hard labour in a prison camp and bring shame down on my family and everyone associated with me. I could be hanged. They don't hang people for that anymore, said Sandys. And none of those are the reason you won't tell him. You won't tell him because you're frightened of what he'll say. There's nothing to tell, Sandys. They looked at each other for a moment, and Gaunt was struck by a strange desire to kiss Sandys on the mouth just to see what it would be like. He clenched his fists at his side and stayed where he was. All right, said Sandys. He looked around at Gaunt's Spartan dormitory as if he were bidding it goodbye. I just wanted to tell you about Stephen. Well, now you've told me. Yes. Sandys continued to hover by the door. I like you, Gaunt. Don't be revolting. Sandys laughed and slipped out of the door. Gaunt was left alone in his dormitory, Sandys's words echoing in his head. You're squandering your years as if they're limitless. Now it's the war, okay, so don't be confused. Friday the 16th of April, 1915, somewhere in Belgium. Dear Sandys, I don't make friends easily. I should say I have only 3. Giddy and Debbie, who I knew in childhood, Ellwood, you. Whenever I'm out of the line, I check the Times for your name and for Gideon's. I began this letter planning to tell you I could not imagine your grief, but that isn't true. I do imagine it, over and over. If you were killed, I doubt I should receive a telegram. Our friendship has always been too tenuous for others to be aware of it. Still, in my imagination, I receive a telegram. I see your name and think, there goes the man I might have spoken to had I only been able to open my mouth. You say that what is left of you is not worth much. I can only respond by assuring you it is worth a great deal to me, your friend, Henry Gaunt. His letter was returned to him a few days later, recipient deceased, stamped across the front. So I was actually trying not to write a novel when I wrote this novel. I had decided, when I left university, I said to myself, I'm going to write a novel a year until I write one that's good. And so I wrote a novel a year for 3 years, and after each novel I would send it out to agents, and I would get a spreadsheet, and I sent it out to 60 to 100 agents per novel, and was rejected or ignored by all of them, and it was really discouraging. And so by the time I finished the third one, my mother was really on my case. She was like, you've got to get a real job, and that's fair. And I was really just trying to be sensible and move on. And so I was working on other things, and while I was doing that, I was reading Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That. Now, Robert Graves was, he's one of the famous soldier poets of World War I. And he wrote this incredible book called Goodbye to All That, which is, it's a memoir of his time in the war. And it's really boring for the first 50 pages, and after that it's very good, but it's hard going to begin with, but it's actually worth it if you persist. So in this book, he talks a lot about his friendship with another famous World War I soldier poet called Siegfried Sassoon. I don't know how much, sometimes at these events I have people who are like really kind of World War I experts, but then I also have people who like know nothing about the war, so I don't want to patronize you, but I'm trying to like find a middle course. Anyway, so Sassoon was another famous war poet, and he and Robert Graves had this very intense friendship. And in the book, they write each other all these letters, and it got me thinking a lot about Sassoon. And Sassoon had gone to my old boarding school in England. And so because I was procrastinating on my work and I didn't really want to do my work, my grown-up reasonable work that was not novel writing, I started Googling around Sassoon and trying to find out if he had ever written any poems about the school or in the school newspaper when he was at the school, which he hadn't because he actually hated the school, so that was a dead end. But what I found was that the school had put up all of the student newspapers from the early part of the last century. And so I ended up reading all of those student papers from 1913 to 1919. And they were really like nothing else I had ever read. So in 1913, these papers, I started reading them, and they were just, they were fun. They were funny, they were irreverent and charming and smug and entitled, and they were these teenage boys who have every reason to believe they're going to inherit the world. And it's cricket matches and debating reports and all that kind of thing. And then the war breaks out, and they are so excited. And they write, all these poems about how they can't wait to go and beat up some Germans. And then they start enlisting, and then they start writing letters back to the school about training and about, when they go over to France and to Belgium about their experiences. But to begin with, these letters are, they talk about how exciting it is that no one's making them wash. And then they start to die. And it falls to their younger brothers and younger friends to write their obituaries, their in memoriams. And these in memoriams at the beginning of the war have this very kind of starry-eyed, really kind of idealist quality, right, where the word gallant gets used over and over again, and they say things like, we envy him his noble death, and which of us would not die for England, and yeah, it was kind of shocking to me that this was how they were writing about the deaths of their brothers and friends. And then the war goes on, and the in memoriams sort of change and become sort of really just hard to read, basically, because what you're witnessing is just like a community trying to be brave in the face of something that's just like completely senseless. And I had read quite a lot of World War I literature prior to this point because I've always had an interest in it. But a lot of the famous World War I literature was written about 10 years after the war, in the late 1920s. That book that I mentioned already, Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That, he had originally started to write it as a novel, and then he scrapped it and he was like, that's no good, and he rewrote it as a memoir. That's also the case with another really famous war memoir, which is A Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain. She started as a novel and then she was like, that's all wrong. She rewrote it as a memoir. And the point is that these books that I had kind of come across before and that are sort of widely studied, they were written by people who had witnessed a devastating trauma and then spent 10 years processing it and then crafted something and really highly polished something that they thought would be able to communicate what they had seen to people who were not there. So the kind of layers of distance and craftsmanship that are in these texts were really, really markedly different from these newspapers, which were just the completely raw feelings of people in a tragedy for other people in that tragedy with them, right? That some 16-year-old boy writing his brother's obituary is not thinking about people who don't know what he's going through. He's thinking about his brother and his own pain, and so it was almost like, you felt like a voyeur reading these. It felt like you weren't really supposed to be there almost, and they were just so incredibly just so sad. And I remember reading a letter from the front that some man wrote. Maybe he was in his mid-20s, and he wrote back to the school and he said something like, in 1915, he said something like, Tuesday was an awfully sad day. I had not known what it would mean to see all of your friends lying dead and dying around you. And then he went on and he died later when he was 27. I can't remember when. But I was reading all of these and really, really becoming kind of caught up in it, and I mean, it was really affecting me. And I was living in Los Angeles, and it was just not, it was like not communicable. People would say to me, at parties, they'd be like, how have you been? And I'd be like, well, I'm really sad about World War I. And they'd be like, right. And they'd be like, oh, like I'm, taking up Pilates. And I'd be like, okay, that's, and I would try and go harder. I'd be like, no, I'm like really genuinely the main thing going on with me right now is that I'm sad about World War I. And they'd be like, that sounds sad. And I'd be like, no, it's not. It's not just that it sounds sad. It's like it's like profound. It's life-changing. And so I was feeling very kind of isolated in this, because even my husband is one of the most mentally stable people I've ever personally known, and I think part of how he stays so stable is that he keeps his head sort of clean of trauma. And so I would try and describe to him like some horrible anecdote I had read, and he would stop me and he'd be like, Alice, I don't want to hear about that. Fair enough. The first thing I started to do, and again, I wasn't trying to write a novel at this point, I just started, these newspapers would be pretty boring, and then there'd be one sentence in the paper that was just like a gut punch. And so I would just type out that sentence, and then I started kind of collating them all, and then I sort of mocked up a newspaper that was a sort of distillation, right, that had all of the most upsetting or funny or just kind of emotionally provoking sentences in one sort of mock newspaper. And I did that for a while. And then the next thing I did, and I think this was because I had been reading Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That. And as I mentioned before, he was friends with this poet, Siegfried Sassoon. And they were not like in love or anything like that, but they did have this very, they were both queer, and they had this very intense friendship that was complicated and kind of stressful. And at a later day, I think it was either Sassoon or Graves, but I think it was Sassoon, said that it always had something heavily sexual about it. And they wrote each other a lot of letters. And the letters that they wrote, there's a lot that's not being said, that you can read between the lines, that there's like tension beneath the surface of the letter. And so the first thing that I wrote was just a series of letters between two young men who were not Graves and Sassoon and were not the protagonists of my novel. They were just two random guys, and they wrote each other a letter each that was very like tense and had a weird amount of baggage. And then the next thing I did was I just kind of wrote the book. I really did. I just sort of sat down, and in about 2 weeks I had most of the first draft. And it just kind of fell out. And so sometimes people are like, so what made you decide to write about Gaunt and Ellwood? And I'm like, I don't know. I just started writing it, and it just happened. Which I should state, because I can hear any writers in here. I can feel, whenever I say that, I can feel the sort of dislike radiating off the audience. But I would like to specify that that is not how things usually go for me. And the current novel I'm writing on is not going that way at all, and has been really pretty hard work. So, this was a one-off. But it did. It came out very, very quickly and easily. And then I spent about 1.5 years editing it so that it made sense. And that was how I kind of wrote the book, as it were. So something that people often ask me about is, they say, so what made you kind of decide to write about queer love, right? You're not a gay male veteran. And I said, well, yeah, that's true, I'm not. Well observed. And I do think it's an interesting question. And of course it was something I was apprehensive about. Because you don't want to do a disservice to anyone, and there's this movement at the moment that I think is really wonderful called the Own Voices movement, which is a kind of push for publishing to prioritize books by people who have the experience that they are writing about. And I think that's really wonderful for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that it means that there are more books by people who know what they're talking about, which is great for me as a reader because I wanted to read those, so that's great. And then the second thing that I think is really great about that movement is that I think it exerts a certain amount of pressure on writers who are writing beyond their experience to kind of hold themselves accountable and really do the research. And that was something that I really wanted to do. And so I did a lot of reading very widely, and I also did a lot of asking friends to read it, and friends who had those experiences. And I listened to their advice, and I changed anything that they said didn't ring true. And that helped me feel a little bit more kind of confident going forward. But ultimately I knew that I knew it was possible because some of my favorite books are about women written by men. I've actually rarely felt as seen as I have by certain female characters written by men. So to me it was obvious that you can write outside your own experience. It's just a question of, are you good enough, really? And so, yeah, it was a question of, could I be good enough, not whether I should, if that makes sense. So some of the reading that I did to kind of get an idea of this, it was a little bit tricky because obviously, in the 1910s, people weren't being terribly explicit about what was going on in their bedroom. So you had to do a little bit of reading between the lines. And there was one book that I found really useful for figuring out what the sort of rules of sexual experimentation were in boarding schools in this time period. Now, obviously, I wasn't there, but there was this one book called The Loom of Youth by Alec Waugh, who is Evelyn Waugh's older brother, and they actually had a lot of beef, which is kind of funny to read about. Alec was his father's favorite son, and Evelyn Waugh wrote Brideshead Revisited. That's what he's most known for. And so he became a much more famous novelist, but when he was young, his older brother Alec, so when Alec was 17, he wrote this book, The Loom of Youth, that immediately became a national bestseller. And so Evelyn Waugh grew up with everyone knowing about his older brother and being like, wow, your older brother is so talented. And Evelyn was just like, I am too. And it was hard, and his father didn't like him as much. And I remember this anecdote about them both coming home, I guess from World War II, and his father had put up a sign. They both came home from the war, and his father had put up a sign that said, "Welcome home, Alec." I might be misremembering that, but his father was a piece of work. The whole family was nasty. Anyway, I could go on about their family for a long time, but that's not relevant. So Alec, because this is the other thing that Alec did to Evelyn, which I think is funny. Evelyn really wanted to go to this one boarding school called Sherborne, which is a very prestigious boarding school, but he wasn't able to go to that boarding school because Alec Waugh was expelled for various gay misdoings and then immediately wrote a tell-all memoir that then became the national bestseller that he wrote when he was 17. And so when then Evelyn Waugh tried to apply to the school was like, no, the last Waugh we had come here wrote a tell-all memoir about his gay exploits at our school, so no, you cannot come. So he was always very resentful about that. Anyway, so this book, The Loom of Youth, is written. It was written by Alec when he was 17, shortly after he had been expelled, and he was training to go and fight in World War I. It was 1917. He was going to go and fight in Passchendaele, which was one of the most horrible battles. It involved a lot of sinking mud. People were drowning in mud. That's the main thing people talk about with Passchendaele. But Alec didn't know that yet, he hadn't gone, but he was writing this book, and it's this quite boring book, but I really loved it because it was atmospheric, and it's about boarding school life. And what I was able to kind of see by reading between the lines, because it is quite, he can't go out and say things that explicitly. But what I was able to kind of deduce was that if you were popular, and if you were good at sport, and if you were doing it secretly, and if you were planning on marrying a woman later, it was somewhat acceptable to experiment sexually with other boys. And I found what to me seemed like confirmation of those set of rules in a couple of other books. There's something that alludes to that in E.M. Forster's Morris, which is a queer classic. That's one of my favorite books, and also really played into In Memoriam. E.M. Forster wrote, he's most famous for Howard's End and Passage to India, but Morris is his only gay novel. He wrote it in 1913, and it's a happy novel. It has a happy ending. And because of that happy ending, he said he wasn't able to publish it. He said, if this novel ended in a suicide pact, I would be able to publish it right now. But because I think that these characters deserve a happy ending, it cannot be published. And it wasn't published until after he died. It was published in the 70s. And I found that really, really meaningful. And it's one of my favorites. I've loved that novel since I was a teenager, and it was definitely something I had in my mind when I was writing my book. So I don't want to give any spoilers away, but that's it is kind of a spoiler, but I guess what I mean is that I think no, it is just a spoiler. But anyway, his optimism, I think, is important. So in Morris, there's an allusion to that kind of set of rules I referred to, and there were also things that kind of seemed to confirm those rules in Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That I keep mentioning. So I set up the boarding school in Memoriam to have that kind of set of rules. And Ellwood, who is the popular, charming one, he is really thriving in this situation. He's, he really understands these rules, and he is exploring his sexuality, and he's kind of not got that much angst because he kind of inherently understands how this world works, and he's popular, and he's good at sport, and he can kind of get away with anything. But Gaunt really doesn't feel that way. And for Gaunt, this is a really grave secret in his heart, and that actually forms the kind of bulk of the reason that they can't communicate with each other, right? Because Gaunt knows that Ellwood is experimenting sexually with other boys, but Ellwood does it in this way that feels so flippant and callous and casual, and Gaunt is so completely head over heels in love with him that he doesn't want to get involved with Ellwood because he's like, I don't want to do this kind of casual thing that he seems to do. Meanwhile, Ellwood just thinks Gaunt is straight. So they both have these very kind of ironclad reasons for why they just can't tell each other this secret that they both have, despite the fact that they're really, really intimate, close friends. And then when they go to the front, the rules change there, because at the boarding school, if you're caught, you get expelled. But if you're caught at the front, the stakes are very different. So I mentioned A Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain, which is another really, really excellent war memoir. And Vera Brittain had this wonderful brother. He was a real feminist at a time when that was not so common. And when she got into Oxford, her parents said, you can't go. And her brother said, well, if she can't go, I'm dropping out of Oxford. And so she was allowed to go because of what he had done. And she was really close with him, and then he died. And so she went to go talk to one of his colleagues, one of his fellow officers who had been there when he had died, because what often happened when people died is they would write these letters back home that said, he died instantly and painlessly. And Vera Brittain was a nurse, so she knew that these men were not dying instantly and painlessly. And so she went to go visit Edward's colleague in hospital, because she wanted to find out what had really happened to her brother. And she describes this as being an incredibly frustrating meeting in which she can tell he's not telling her the truth. She knows that something happened that she doesn't understand about her brother's death, but that this man won't tell her what it is. And she also felt the distinct feeling that that this man is paranoid that she's trying to get him to marry her, because at this point in the war, so many men had died that there were all these single women who were just never going to have a chance to get married. And so a lot of the single men started feeling like hounded by women wherever they went. And so she feels very indignant about this. And what she discovered much later, or at least what we think happened, it's not completely clear, is that her brother, who was gay, had written some compromising letters to another man, and those letters were caught. And so he knew he was about to be court-martialed, and rather than face the court-martial and the shame that would bring to everyone he knew, he just walked into enemy fire and was killed. And so those are the stakes in the front, right? They are really, life and death stakes. And Gaunt understands this inherently. He really, it feels real to him how serious and dangerous it would be for them to kind of pursue any kind of sexual relationship. But Ellwood is still sort of in this boarding school mindset, and he really has this, he's like 17, so he just feels like he's going to get away with everything forever. And that's a real source of tension between them in the book. I just want to check in on time, because I realize I've been monologuing. How are we doing? Well, yeah. How much longer do I have? Great, thank you. Approximately 27 minutes, just if I had to guess. Yeah, so, let me think. I guess I'll talk a little bit about, because I was talking about Vera Brittain, about women and the female characters in Memoriam. There are not a whole lot of them. I remember I asked my editor, I was like, is there any chance of being a Reese's book pick? And she was like, well, they want books about women, Alice. And I was like, right, yeah, no, this is not that. There are a couple of women in the book, and one of my favorite characters in the book is Gaunt's sister. So Gaunt has a sister called Maud, and Maud has her DNA in Vera Brittain. And in fact, all three of the protagonists have, I call it the DNA in these historical figures. So Gaunt has his DNA in Robert Graves. Robert Graves was half German. Robert Graves was good at boxing, and he loved Greek mythology, and he was a bit of a pacifist. And Sassoon, who is kind of the DNA for Ellwood, he was culturally Christian but ethnically Jewish, and very romantic and very good at cricket. And Vera Brittain, who has the kind of, I took the DNA from Vera Brittain for Maud. Vera Brittain was very pretty, as she will tell you repeatedly throughout her memoir, and funny and a feminist and very kind of politically clued in. And so I took those traits and I planted them in Maud. But to be clear, they aren't those characters. It's just that I took specifics from these people. So Maud is like Vera Brittain. And through Maud, I kind of tried to give a kind of glancing overview of the ways in which things were really very difficult for women during the war. And of course, Maud is, I think the book itself is unfair on Maud because the book is really told from the perspective of Gaunt and Ellwood. And they both let her down in different ways. So it's almost like she needs her own book. But I'm not going to do that. But someone else can. And she has this, she has a very complicated relationship with Ellwood, for instance, because at the beginning of the book, Ellwood is someone who I would call a sort of like a benign misogynist, right? He thinks women are very delicate and very sweet, and they should be kept safe and sound on a pedestal. And then as he spends more time, don't worry, you haven't missed much. And as the war goes on, he becomes really kind of twisted up. And what started off as this kind of benign kind of sexism of like, oh, women, isn't it sweet how innocent they are, becomes this just like fury with how innocent he believes them to be. Like, why are they so ignorant of what he has been through? Which of course is really unfair, because Maud does know what he's been through. She's a nurse. She's really seen what he's talking about, and he is completely unwilling to understand her point of view on this. And there was this wonderful book that I read when I was researching kind of women in the war, and it was called Singled Out by Virginia Nicholson. And it was about the million surplus women, right? So about 1 million British men died in World War I. And that left 1 million women, roughly, who were just never going to be able to get married. And the first part of the book really, really details how incredibly tragic this is, you know, and there's so many just devastating anecdotes about, I mean, for one, sorry, I'm remembering just too many things at once. You know, she talks about, there's this one woman she talked about who was engaged to be married to a really wonderful man, but when he came home from the war, he was just so different from how he had been, and she was really ambitious, and he had been ambitious as well, but after the war he just sat on his sofa and just didn't do anything for years, and finally she just had to break it off. And you know, she had to break it off knowing that there probably wouldn't be a man for her to marry. And I remember there's something that's in the book that I lifted from this wonderful Virginia Nicholson book, which is that she talks about this headmistress at a school for girls in Bournemouth who gave a speech to her girls, and she said, only 1 in 10 of you will ever get married. That is not an opinion, that is a statistical fact. And just the idea of being 19, 20 and knowing that you just aren't going to, like, there just isn't someone for you. And you know, there's so many ways that spreads out, right? Like, you know, you have these women writing in to agony aunts saying, you know, I'm really, really sexually frustrated, but of course masturbation is bad for your health and I don't know what to do. And the agony aunts would write back and say, well, you've just got to do lots of charity work. And, you know, it was a real problem. And, you know, what's sort of surprising and kind of fascinating to me about this is that on an individual level, the number of just absolutely incredibly sad, heartbreaking stories of women who, you know, lost someone they loved, or, you know, had never found someone to love because of this. You know, it's just devastating. But what's weird is that it had a profound positive impact on feminism. Because prior to the war, you know, the understanding was that, at least among middle class and upper class women, that you would get married and your husband would support you. Working class women have always worked, right? So that's something we forget about sometimes. But after the war, that just didn't work. You couldn't say, oh, well, women should get married to men who will take care of them. You kind of had to, they had to allow the idea of women living by themselves and having jobs. And that became much more common. And then girls started moving to London, like, with a bunch of friends and spending their 20s living in an apartment with their friends and going out to parties. And there wasn't really very much that you could say against that. And from a queer perspective, you know, this made things, I was just talking about this to you, it made things much easier for lesbians, as you can imagine, because, you know, before it might have been like, well, why aren't you getting married, Mabel? And now it was like, well, Mabel lives with her dear friend Mildred, and that's her future now, you know? And that, it was just, yeah, so in the 1930s, there were, I can't remember, Virginia Nicholson talks about this, but I seem to remember there was some kind of feminist conference, and they looked back on the gains that had been made in the last, 20, 15 years, and they were just astonished, because if you had projected forwards in 1912 as to what you thought women would be allowed to do in 15 years, you could not possibly have imagined the world that they lived in the 30s. It was just night and day. I mean, for one thing, they got the vote. Women could only vote from the age of, this is all England, I'm sorry, I realize that America had its own stuff going on at this time period. But, you know, yeah, they got the vote from the age of 21. Men could vote from 18, but they didn't want women to vote from 18 because then there would have been more women voting, right? Because so many men had died that if the women were voting at the same age, they would have been the majority, and that was very frightening to people. So yeah, so it's something that I think about because I find it sort of alarming but also heartening because you know, the people who lived through World War I think would have had a really hard time imagining that something good had come out of it that was so unexpected, and yet the rights that I think I have had and that any woman nowadays have had, a lot of those rights kind of stem directly from the progress that was made in women's rights after World War I. So it's a strange one because you don't want to be like, oh, that was worth it, but it's heartening in that I like thinking that when something cataclysmic happens in a society, there are many bad things that will come from it, but unexpectedly there will be good that comes from it as well that you can't foresee, you can't predict, and it's unimaginable what the good will be in the same way that it's unimaginable what the bad will be. So I found that quite thought-provoking. Anyway, so it was a very, very, very good book.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Alice Winn and her work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about the use of poetry in Winn's novel.
The book is called In Memoriam for 3 reasons. One is that the in memoriams in the newspapers were one of the great inspirations for me. And 2 is that I think the book itself serves as like an in memoriam for the characters of the book. But the 3rd reason is that it is a reference, obviously, to Tennyson's In Memoriam AHH. So Tennyson was this, you know, really, really famous Victorian poet, and he was the poet laureate. And when he was 22, he was at Cambridge and he had made friends with this guy called Arthur Hallam, and they were just best friends. I remember there's this description of they were in a secret society, which sounds sort of cool, except like the secret society, it was a secret debating society. So they would like meet up and debate, and that was their secret. So it wasn't that. So I don't know why it had to be secret really, but they would meet up and debate, and I remember this description of someone's debate being so funny that Tennyson was literally rolling on the floor with laughter. So he and Arthur, who had met through this debating society, had this really wonderful friendship, and then when Arthur was 22, he very suddenly died. And Tennyson spent the next 17 years writing poetry about his grief and the process that he went through in processing this grief. And the poem is called In Memoriam, AHH. And Ellwood is obsessed with this poem, and he's obsessed with Tennyson more generally. To be clear, Tennyson I do not think was like gay or romantically involved with Arthur Hallam, but I think Ellwood comes to see Arthur Hallam and Tennyson as this sort of emblem of himself and Gaunt. And so he's able to kind of queer code Tennyson for himself. And Tennyson represents to Ellwood this kind of worldview, because Tennyson writes incredibly beautiful poetry. It's some of the most euphonic poetry in literature. It's lyrical, it sounds like music. And he writes a lot about war and things, but like that, but he writes about them in this very grand and noble way, right? So he has this very famous poem called The Charge of the Light Brigade, which some of you are nodding. It's this poem about this disaster that happened in, God, what war was it? It must have been the Crimea? Oh, someone just muttered the Crimea. Yeah, all right. So it must have been the Crimea, in which there was a miscommunication between generals, and 600 men on horses were told to just charge at some guns. And they were like, that's not a good plan, you know, that's a definitely bad plan. But they were noble, good British soldiers, so they just did it, and then they were mostly all killed. And the poem presents this as this incredibly wonderful, noble thing to do. And I've taught this poem to teenagers now before, and they always are like, this poem is so stupid, why don't they just say this is a bad idea? So it's a way of thinking that it is kind of alien, I think, to us. But it represents how Ellwood comes to this war, right? Ellwood comes to World War I with this idea that there is something inherently noble about dying gloriously in battle for your country. And I found it so fascinating when I was seeing traces of that in the in memoriams in the newspaper. And you can see it in children's books that they were reading. When you read The Jungle Book by Kipling, you know, a lot of that book is Mowgli just suffering very bravely, and then at the end, you know, someone will be like, you suffered well, my son, you know, and you can see that kind of was in the zeitgeist. And so for Ellwood, Tennyson represents, you know, a whole world that is lost in the course of World War I. And so his relationship with Tennyson changes as the war goes on, and he ends up turning on Tennyson and feeling really furious with Tennyson and feeling as if Tennyson has kind of betrayed him by making him believe in something that never existed. And he turns on him to an extent that I think is sort of, it makes me sad, because he kind of throws the baby out with the bathwater, right? He turns on everything that Tennyson stands for, including the beauty. And then, generally speaking, throughout the poem, Ellwood usually communicates through poetry. He thinks that that's very clear. So he'll feel something, and then he kind of lets a poem come to his mind. And I would do this by, you know, I would know Ellwood wants to quote a piece of poetry, and I would kind of just like close my eyes and I would wait for a piece of poetry to come to me. And sometimes it was annoying because a piece of poetry would come to me that was like by W.H. Auden, and I'd be like, well, he hasn't written that yet, so I can't use that poem. So I'd have to close my head and wait for another poem that was more appropriate. And you know, he'll say a piece of poetry and then think that he has communicated something very clear. You know, he'll think he has just confessed undying love, but of course the person who he's speaking to is just like, well, that's a nice poem, you know. So yeah, it was very fun having that as a trait for Ellwood. But of course, as he gets more disconnected from poetry, he actually becomes less able to communicate, because poetry was how he was able to communicate, and then he loses contact with that.
This audience member asks if Winn ever wishes she includes something in her book after it's been published.
I had trouble because there is a character at the front who is a working class officer. And in British literature, most of the British war literature is written by upper class men or upper class women. But it's really noticeable that it's stark, because in Germany you have some famous books written by working class, I mean at least privates, right? All Quiet on the Western Front is from the perspective of some privates. And Le Feu by Henri Barbusse, which is the most famous, well, one of the most famous French books, is also from the perspective of a private. But in England, there's much, much less of that. And I found this really puzzling, and I couldn't figure out whether the books had been written and then just kind of buried, or whether they were written and never published, or whether they hadn't been written because working class soldiers had less access to education. I don't know at what point there was a barrier, but there certainly seems to have been a barrier. And there are a couple of things that I was able to use. There's a wonderful book by David Jones called In Parenthesis, which T.S. Eliot thought was one of the most wonderful pieces of literature he had ever read, but it's not very famous, which I think is kind of part of this mystery I'm talking about, this, like, I guess it's a conspiracy, really. Point is, I was trying to research, you know, this character David Hayes's perspective on the war, and I was really having a hard time finding what I wanted. And then recently, I reviewed a book by a guy called Michael Korda, and it was a story of war poets. It was a biography of 6 war poets. And one of the war poets he mentioned was someone I had never heard of, whose name was Isaac Rosenberg, and he was a working class Jewish poet. And I just was like, I would have loved to know about this guy, but I mean, I read so widely, and I you know, maybe I came across his poetry in an anthology once. That's it, though. But it would have been so useful to have him as a perspective to kind of draw into the novel more. So that was first when I read that chapter, I was like, where was this book like 3 years ago?
Our next question comes from an audience member wondering about Winn's writing and editing process.
I write really bad first drafts, and I do think, I really believe that people have completely different approaches to this. Some people, like I have a friend, her first drafts are perfect because she doesn't move on to the next page until the first page is perfect. And then by the end of it, she's written one draft, it took her 6 months, and it's perfect. That's really not how I work. And so my first draft was like, what if this entire book was just sort of bad and stupid? It really just was. And then I just made it slightly less bad and stupid as I went. And as to the research, one of the reasons I stopped at about sort of the 70,000 word mark. It's 100,000 words. That means nothing to people who aren't writers, but you understand. So one of the reasons I stopped there was that at a certain point in the book, there were a couple of things where I just didn't have the kind of baseline knowledge to write. Because I had a baseline understanding of like boarding school and what your average day in the Western Front was like. And so I could write that without having to research it too much. But then there's a point when there's a prisoner of war section where a character, and I don't want any spoilers, ends up in a prisoner of war. And I love talking about this part because the prisoner of war, I knew nothing about officer prisoner of war camps, but they are hilarious, it turns out. And I found this book by this guy called Evans, and it's called The Escaping Club. It's a really good book. It is racist. So, just bear that in mind. And it's also xenophobic. He's not like a great guy, but he's very funny. And the book is about how he gets stuck in this prisoner of war camp and spends his entire time trying to escape the camp, and everyone in the camp is trying to escape the camp, right? And he makes it feel as if this prisoner of war camp is like this hilarious sideshow to the Western Front, where it's like, I hadn't realized this, but the German prison guards would make the officers sign a piece of paper in which they would promise not to escape. And if they signed that piece of paper, they could go on walks into the town. And they did, and no one ever escaped because they had given their word. So that all functioned correctly. And Evans, I didn't put this in the book, but so Evans, after a huge, he ends up escaping via jumping out the window of a train. And he makes it all the way back to the UK, and then immediately goes back to Palestine, where he's a pilot, and he instantly gets shot down and captured again. And so he's in a Turkish prisoner of war camp now. And it's not super nice. And so some German officers walk by and see him, and they seem to feel this sort of esprit de corps, like, oh, we're fellow Europeans. And so they break him out of but the Turkish and the Germans were allies, right? Like the Germans are the enemy. So they break him out of the prison camp and they take him back to their train. And they're like, look, can you just promise not to escape and then we'll take you back to Germany? And he's like, yeah, that's fine. So he promises not to escape. So they all put away their guns, and then they travel by train to Germany, having these like really lavish dinners and talking about the war. And it's all these conversations where they're like, well, we think we're going to win the war. And Evans is like, no chance, we're winning the war. And then they just argue about it, and then they deliver him to this prison camp, which he then promptly escapes from again. So it was just this, it was such a bizarre thing. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's not really answering your question. The point is, things like that, like I knew from the way I had written the first draft, I was like, okay, there's a prisoner of war sequence here. But I didn't know it would be funny until I read the research, right? And then I was like, oh, it's funny. And yeah, I would layer things in as I went, right? Because you would read something and be like, oh, that's really useful. And there's a plot point earlier in the book that right now is a bit clunky. And if I replace that with this piece of like information that I've just discovered, that whole section will be cleaner. So that was really, really how I did it.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member asking about the effects of war on Winn's characters.
I think Ellwood is someone who at the beginning of the novel is already angry. And you can see this, there's this moment at the beginning of the novel where, Gaunt talks about how, or thinks about how, just last week Ellwood was reduced to tears of rage because he lost a cricket match, whereas Gaunt himself hasn't cried since he was 9. And they sort of switch, right? Ellwood is someone who, at the beginning of the novel, like, his problem is that I guess he's volatile all the way through, but he becomes more volatile and sort of less able to communicate himself, like communicate what he feels. And a lot of the traits that are in him to begin with, he's someone who's a sore loser. But by the end of the book, he's someone who's throwing glasses at his mother, right? So things that were already not ideal about him just become massively worsened by his experience. Whereas I think in many ways, Gaunt becomes softened and kinder by his experiences, because I think something I found from reading the literature is that, that there were people who felt as if in some way they had been improved by the war, which is a very uncomfortable thing for them to have to grapple with. And this is something that I drew on in the book. There's this, in the introduction to Siegfried Sassoon's book of poems, Counterattack, he has this conversation. The guy who's writing the introduction, Robert Nichols, talks about a conversation he had with Sassoon where he said, "It feels like the war improved you." And Sassoon says, "That's dangerous even to speak of. It might have improved 1,000,000 men, but that wouldn't change the fact that it was a crime against humanity." And the risk of saying, the war improved you, is that it might make people think, and thus war is good. And he was like, there's no amount of personal improvement that I could have had that would make it worth it, even though he did actually feel that it had made a man of him. So I think that's sort of a little bit what happens with Gaunt, but with Ellwood, it's really the opposite. And when you were talking about what happened to soldiers with PTSD, I was thinking of, my mother sent me this Frank O'Connor quote recently. So Frank O'Connor, this Irish writer, and he wrote this, I don't know what the context was because my mother just sent me the quotation, but he was on a bus and there was this kind of homeless looking crazy guy, and he was sort of bothering people, and Frank O'Connor was like, I just instantly disliked him. I felt kind of repulsed by him. And then the man starts kind of getting on the floor and rifling, with his rifle. And then the man starts saying Jimmy, Jimmy, and then he leans over and says, oh, he's gone. And then takes over this other guy, this imaginary dead man's rifle, and starts rifling more. And then shrieks and touches, he was missing one leg, right? And touches his leg and starts crying and being like, my leg. And Frank O'Connor writes, I've never felt so ashamed of myself. And I don't know, but I think that it was, I think that was something that was just in the world after World War I. I think there were a lot of, people behaving crazily in public, and everyone kind of just felt uncomfortable about it. And Robert Graves talks about something. He says, immediately after the war, for about 4 weeks, there was an incredible sort of surge of goodwill for soldiers. And if you got a really good job in that 4-week period, you're great. But after that 4-week period, if you try to get a job as a soldier, they'd be like, so you have a 4-year gap on your resume? And you'd be like, yeah, I was fighting in the war. And they'd be like, well, that actually, that makes you less employable. And they would hire someone who didn't have a 4-year gap on their resume. And it's something that I thought about a lot during the pandemic, because I remember when we were cheering every night for hospital workers and essential workers, I remember thinking, this is great, but it's not going to last. We're gonna turn on these people instantly. And then in the UK there was this whole thing where they immediately after the pandemic they were like, okay, now all hospital workers have to pay for parking. And I was like, what? I was like, I just felt like you could see it, and I think it seems to be a pattern in human society that people are brave. And in fact, there was a scientific study recently that showed that if someone is seen as a hero, most people are likely to think that person should be paid less. They did this study where they showed pictures of firefighters and nurses, and then they would show them and they would describe them in different ways. And the people to whom they had described them as heroes and selfless and brave afterwards were less likely to say, oh, that person would need a lot of money. They were more likely to be like, well, that person's probably doing it because they're so selfless, so they can probably do it on a pittance. So, sorry, I'm really getting off topic here, but it all kind of ties in with what you see after the war. Thank you so much. You've been just so lovely, and thank you for having me.
That wraps up our St. Paul Public Library event with Alice Winn. Make sure to catch our next podcast with Melanie Benjamin. Melanie Benjamin is the historical fiction novelist behind such literary blockbusters as The Aviator's Wife, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, and The Children's Blizzard. Her latest, California Golden, turns the spotlight to Malibu in the 1960s, in the formative but factious genesis of California surf culture. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including MELSA, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.